Welcome to the inaugural event of the Distinguished Lecture Series, co-sponsored by Merck and Riffyn. I'm Tim Gardner, the founder and CEO of Riffyn, and it's my pleasure to host the discussion tonight. I'm joining from Oakland, California, and I'm honored to have here with me two distinguished guests, Dr. Muhammad Zaman, Howard Hughes Medical Institute professor of Boston University. He's joining us from his home in Boston, and Dr. Daria Hazuda, Vice President of Infectious Diseases at Merck. She's joining us from her home in Pennsylvania. Muhammad and Daria, thank you for being here tonight. Our topic is the history of microbial resistance and what it can teach us about the future of pandemics. In 2014, a report titled Tackling Drug-Resistant Infections Globally was commissioned by the UK government and the Wellcome Trust. The report states that by 2050, 10 million lives a year and a cumulative $100 trillion of economic output are at risk due to the rise of drug-resistant infections, if we do not find proactive solutions to slow down the rise of drug resistance. That might have seemed absolutely absurd about a year ago until we experienced COVID-19. And tonight we'll explore the implications of this in depth. So we'll begin our program in a moment with introductions of Dr. Hazuda and Zaman. But before that, I wanted to note that part of the objective of this distinguished lecture series is to highlight the works and ideas of scientists and engineers from a diverse social backgrounds and to bring those messages to the widest possible audience. To that end, we partnered for this event with Laney College. It's a community college in Oakland, California, with a biotechnology associate's degree program. We offered students who registered for the event tonight the opportunity to get mentored by scientists at both Riffyn and Merck. And I'm really happy to say that we had 10 students sign up to be mentored, and we had 15 scientists from Riffyn and Merck who have volunteered to be mentors. And so we'll be following up after the program to pair those folks up. As the evening unfolds, I just wanted to remind you that you can send any questions you have for the speakers tonight to us on Twitter by using the hashtag Riffyn Events, all one word, Riffyn Events on Twitter. And we'll capture any questions you send, and I will relay them to our guests as we can. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Daria Hazuda. She's the Vice President of Infectious Diseases at Merck, and she's also the Chief Scientific Officer of the MRL Cambridge Exploratory Science Center. Daria will also join us after Dr. Zaman speaks as a panelist for the discussion. That will be a 30-minute discussion followed by the 30-minute presentation. Daria joined Merck in 1989, where she has discovered and led the development of multiple antiviral drugs, including the first HIV integrase strand transfer inhibitor. It's a drug called Acinitobacter, and that drug is now a frontline therapy for HIV, including for drug-resistant strains of HIV. In addition to her work on HIV, Daria has led the discovery and development of a two-drug combination therapy for hepatitis C. She's a member of the American Academy of Microbiology. She's been awarded multiple honors, including the David Berry DART Achievement Award, the Prague Gallienne Award for her work on Acinitobacter, and the 2018 Distinguished Research Career Award in Retrovirology from The Ohio State University. Daria, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, thank you, Tim. It's actually a real honor and a pleasure to be here today, co-hosting this event on behalf of Merck and Riffyn, and to share the stage with such a distinguished individual as Dr. Zaman. At Merck, we believe that science is driven by new ideas and perspectives, and we repeatedly see from research and our own experiences that having a diverse set of thoughts and experiences is really key to innovative thinking, key to discovery, and really key to bringing together the new ideas that really have the potential to have a broad impact. At Merck, we strive to create an environment where diverse perspectives are valued, respected, and try as hard as possible to use diversity and the infusion of new ideas as a source of inspiration and innovation. To be able to do this well, we must create a diverse employee base in all areas of science and take every opportunity to promote STEM careers to everyone, including many populations who otherwise would be discouraged or even not discouraged, but in some cases completely unaware of the potential that exists to make an impact through a career in STEM. I think this is an excellent opportunity to do that, and I'm certainly delighted to be part of this event. Now let me introduce Dr. Zaman, who's the highlight of this evening. Dr. Zaman is a Howard Hughes Medical Institute professor of biomedical engineering and international health at Boston University. He's author of Biography of Resistance, which is an amazing book about the history of antibiotics and bacterial infection. Muhammad was born in Islamabad, and he immigrated to the United States, where he earned his master's and PhD in physical chemistry at the University of Chicago. He then worked as a fellow at MIT and a professor at UT Austin before joining faculty at Boston University School of Engineering. Dr. Zaman's research is divided into two main areas, global health and cancer. In the area of global health, his team focuses on understanding disease determinants, developing better diagnostics, and helping local stakeholders implement evidence-based policies. His work particularly focuses on antimicrobial resistance, and he works closely in the field with local organizations to help refugees and marginalized populations. The second area of Dr. Zaman's lab is in the fundamental questions around tumor metastasis, with cell migration, and cell matrix interactions. Dr. Zaman also sponsors a vibrant multidisciplinary undergraduate educational program that focuses on learning and partnership, fieldwork in Africa, and technology development for high-impact diseases which afflict low-income countries. He's written two incredible books and authored dozens of columns, the Express Tribune, Huffington Post, and has been highlighted in a number of popular publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, etc. Dr. Zaman, it is truly an honor and a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Daria and Tim. I'm absolutely honored to be here today, not only because of the wonderful work that your institutions do, but also the opportunity to speak to many colleagues, including those who are joining us as mentees. So this is just a wonderful program. I'm really honored. We are living in a complex time, and I recognize that yet another talk about an infectious disease or a series of infections that can really make a tremendous impact on the world can be tiring. So we're not going to talk about that. Instead, we're going to talk about learning from the past of how we can do things, learning from history for that to be avoided, for that not to happen. So the question that I'll ask is, what can the history of antibiotic resistance tell us about future pandemics? I recognize that this is a diverse audience, and I'm really honored to be a part of that. So I'll just say a word about what antibiotic resistance means here, and that is some of the most potent arsenal of our drugs, things that you may have seen, Cipro, azithromycin, these kinds of drugs would stop working. One of the things that I learned early on, and I think it's a misnomer, it's not the people who become resistant, it's the pathogens. So how do we think about that? Where did it come from? And what does it tell us about the future? There are a number of lessons here from my own work and in writing of the book that I'll share, and I'll leave it up to you to think about how we can think about those lessons and apply them to understand where we are and about future pandemics. There has been a lot of conversation about the Spanish flu and the 1918 pandemic. A significant part of that was actually not very far from where I live in Boston. It affected the globe, and people all across the world were affected. This included people like Mahatma Gandhi in India, who was sick, people like Mustafa Kemal in Turkey, as well as T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot's book, The Wasteland, in many ways was derived from his experience living in that time. In the place where I was born in Pakistan, which was sort of India at that time, about 40% of the entire global toll of the pandemic, about 50 million, 40% of that, about 20 million people died, to the point that there was the Ganges, the great river in India, was swarming with bodies. So I'm not going to talk about the great pandemic here, but a couple of interesting things there that might be of interest. One of them was that in 2008, a paper came that said that actually it was not the viral infection that delivered the knockout punch in causing that widespread mortality. It was actually the secondary bacterial infection. So think of it as a dual assault. So the viral infection would happen, but what was really going to cause mortality and morbidity was the bacterial infection. And this was also seen in the paper around the same time. What I want to draw your attention to is the senior author on the first paper, Anthony S. Fauci, somebody who we have gotten to know a little bit and have sort of listened to his advice in the last year or so. Dr. Fauci used samples, tissue samples preserved from that time, as well as diaries of doctors and analysis from the patient histories to demonstrate that it was actually the bacterial infection. Now, at that time, there were no antibiotics that were used in anywhere in the world. The first antibiotic hadn't been discovered at that time, as a matter of fact. However, we live in a different world where there are antibiotics that are available. However, the problem is that we have increasing resistance. So the first lesson I want to share with you all is that bacteria and viruses can collaborate to pack a nasty punch. We shouldn't think that viral diseases work in some kind of isolation. They, along with bacterial diseases, can work together. So we have to think broadly. And again, I think this goes even beyond that as well. So that's the first lesson that I wanted to share with you. Many people ask me, why do I write? And this is not at all usual in engineering and science communities. Certainly, there have been remarkable authors in the last, I would say, well, for a long time, who have written for public audience, but it certainly is not the common approach. I write because I think, and in this day and age, it is important for voices from scientists and engineers to engage broader public. I was telling Tim before we started that I have two kids, both of them in high school, a senior and a freshman. And I want them to read as well about science written by scientists. I want my neighbors and my aunt and people in my mosque and people in my kids' school reading and engaging with science. And I think scientists have a role and responsibility to do that. I also write because academic writing increasingly has become very guarded. It is only to please a reviewer or write about a specific topic, not broad. And there is a value, of course, in that writing. But if you want to engage the general public, the person on the street, the person who's sitting next to you in the subway, well, we need to write broadly. And I also write because it is a wonderful experience to meet people all over the world, or sometimes meet the descendants of famous scientists, including Hans Christian Gram. This doodle is from September of 2019. Anybody who's done any bacterial work starts off with saying gram staining, gram positive or gram negative. Well, it was wonderful to learn about who Mr. Gram was, or Dr. Gram rather, what he was doing in Germany when he discovered the stain. I spent some time in the archives in Denmark. I spoke to his great-granddaughter. I went to his gravestone. And it was just a wonderful experience to be in that environment, to learn about great science, of unassuming people who made remarkable contributions that live to this day. There has been a lot of discussion about bacteria and viruses lately. Phages, the viruses, these tiny little things that can live inside a bacterial cell or commandeer its machinery and really sort of be an alternate to antibiotics were discovered well before antibiotics. On the left-hand side is Dr. Frederick Twort, and on the right-hand side is Dr. Felix Durrell. So Dr. Twort was the original discoverer of phages, but he didn't get enough credit. As a matter of fact, he left science because there was no funding left for his work. Dr. Felix Durrell was this larger-than-life, flamboyant character who really popularized phages to the point that the famous novel that got the Pulitzer Prize, Aerosmith, was written about him. But the phages faded. This great discovery was sort of in the background for decades before they came back. Why did that happen? There's something to think about. What happens to great discoveries, and when is the right time for that? And I'll come to that in due course. Of course, many of us are familiar with the discovery of antibiotics and this window that was left open by Sir Alexander Fleming, and so there was mold that was growing. The mold that came in and killed the bacteria. The story is actually a lot less exciting than that. Probably he didn't leave any windows open. The windows were very far behind the benches, and he was a sort of a small man. There was no way he could have gone on the other side of the bench, moved the benches, and opened those windows. But it makes for a good story. And there's something that you need to think about, sort of doing the hard work of science that may not always be sexy or exciting or glamorous, but still gets things done. In early 1930s, sulfur drugs were being used as an antibiotic, and they were curing people who were very prominent, including the son of the President of the United States, young FDR. But by the time the Second World War came along, sulfur drugs had stopped working altogether, to the point that Brigadier General Elliot Cutler, who was in charge of the Western Theater in Europe, when he was asked by the members of the Parliament in England, can it be said that the sulfonamides as used by US armed forces have saved lives? And he said no. So the second lesson for us is there were plenty of early troubling signs, perhaps something for us to think about as we think about future pandemics. It doesn't happen all of a sudden. There are reasons, there are signs, and we need to pay attention to them. One of the things, and this is one of the great lessons from writing this book, and I think in general, is that the story of science has been written as a story of great white men. And there's a problem there. And there are actually two problems there. First of all, great men of science like Louis Pasteur on the left-hand side and Koch on the right-hand side made incredible discoveries, but they were not perfect men either. Pasteur actually knew little about vaccination, so a lot of his vaccination was just theater and a drama. Koch, on the other hand, also had his own challenges. In German East Africa, he did work and pushed a therapy that was absolutely toxic, created massive problems, blindness, pain among African who were basically colonized, and he didn't back down. So there were these white men who were doing great work, but they were also not perfect. At the same time, there were these incredible women whose stories have not been told. So just as Sir Alexander Fleming received the Nobel Prize and made his famous speech about the possibility of antimicrobial resistance has started to emerge in the hospitals. One of the best papers I've ever read was written by Dr. Mary Barber. It's about 2 pages long. It's available on the internet. It talks about staph infections due to penicillin-resistant strains. It's powerful, it's direct, it's clear, it's precise. I quote a paragraph from the paper. It says, "It is obvious that the main cause for this increase in penicillin-resistant strains of staph is the widespread use of penicillin, although a patient yielding such an organism may not himself have ever had any." This was absolutely remarkable. The penicillin honeymoon was coming to an end. But she was not the only one who was an absolutely remarkable scholar whose story has not been told. A modern hospital in Australia was coming to the fore, well ahead of its time and well ahead of what was happening in the United States or in England. Dr. Phyllis Roundtree was one of the most brilliant bacteriologists Australia had ever produced. She couldn't even get into university because she was a woman, even though she was far smarter than all of her brothers and everybody else she knew. She was the one who actually discovered the source of what was called the nursery epidemic, or the nursery outbreak of staph infection in the children's ward. And Dr. Claire Pasteur, who worked also in Australia, came up with a modern method of hospital hygiene that are still used to this day. They, along with others, were pioneers in combating antimicrobial resistance. And of course, just as the people thought, and the world thought, as a matter of fact, that you'll always have a new antibiotic around the corner, and the big deal was methicillin, known by its name, salbennin here. Dr. Patricia Jain said, well, there is reason to be worried. And again, I quote from a remarkable paper: "It is well known that patients with infected skin can be dangerous sources of infection in hospital, and the finding of just such a patient infected with salbennin resistant strain in this instance adds an additional warning." This happened nearly a decade before MRSA, which is still a problem all over the world, was discovered in the United States towards the end of the decade. So the third lesson is the story of discovery is incomplete. It's often biased, and it's also inaccurate. Something for us to think about. As you move along in the story of antibiotic resistance discovery and the discovery of research and new therapies, there's something to be said about sort of this time and space continuum, something that I've always been fascinated in physics. In a strange way, it appears in the story of antimicrobial resistance. I'll tell two small anecdotes. The first one is a really remarkable collaboration between two unlikely research partners. Dr. Hazel Barton, who's shown on the top, who's a professor at the University of Akron, and Dr. Jerry Wright, who was a professor at McMaster University. They teamed up together to do a very simple experiment, to go deep into the caves of sort of a cave system in New Mexico where no person had gone. These cave systems have not been touched, or rather had not been touched, for 4 million years, well before the discovery of any antibiotics. Dr. Hazel Barton, who is a cave microbiologist, went down, scooped up from the surface, and brought the samples back up. And what they found was these bacteria that nobody had ever touched, no antibiotics, no human interaction, were resistant not just to the frontline antibiotics, but some of the most sophisticated antibiotics. Another story. The Yanomami tribe was an uncontacted tribe, was seen at the border between Venezuela and Brazil in late 2000s, before 2010. And as is the practice in public health, if anybody spots them, in this case it was the Venezuelan army on a helicopter mission, you have to inoculate them, you have to vaccinate them, because other people can also come in contact with them. Before they inoculated this community, they collected sort of samples from sort of dead skin or fecal samples. Again, something remarkable. Those samples showed sign of antimicrobial resistance. This doesn't mean that humans aren't responsible. This just means that we need a much more nuanced approach to understand AMR, just as we need a nuanced approach to understand viral dynamics, where it emerges, how it emerges, what it does. For too long, we have thought about antimicrobial resistance as a story of bad patients and bad doctors. You were supposed to take Cipro for 5 days, you took it for 3. You didn't have antibiotic, you didn't have any bacterial infection, and the primary care doctor gave it to you. Both of those things are a problem. But that again would be an incomplete story if you focused only on that. In early 2000s, in the second Gulf War, soon after the invasion of Iraq, the US ground troops started seeing the rise of an antibiotic-resistant pathogen called Acinitobacter Bombani. This was a mouthful for the Congress and others, so they started calling it Iraqi bacter. Nobody knew where it came from. But what they did know was that it was affecting patients, it was affecting soldiers. Congressional hearings had to be had. These people were brought back to Walter Reed, and most of them did okay. Unfortunately, the people living in that part of the world did not. Kids who were not even born at that time now face that threat. That problem has become indigenized. It is now in the environment. This is something that was seen not just in Iraq, but in other places of conflict as well. A story from CNN on the left-hand side says the US defeated Kabul superbugs in its military, but locals still struggle. Conflict is a driver for drug resistance. The wounds are very, very deep. And I know this is cliche to talk about world peace, but in many ways, the global political aspect of this challenge is underappreciated and something that needs to be looked at. Will the next superbug come from Yemen, a place that has seen an immoral war go on for about 7 years, where infrastructure has been destroyed, where public health system has completely collapsed, where the waterways are contaminated by bunker buster bombs or other arsenal, where there is no Marshall Plan to clean up. And I think it is something to think about. The next superbug wouldn't need a visa to enter any given country. Something for us to think about as we think about where the next pandemic might come from. So the fifth lesson is politics and conflict drive AMR, not just in the region, but globally. A problem that starts in one part of the world can reach another one. And this is not just a situation of 2019. The nursery epidemic in Australia reached Denmark, Canada, United States, India. This is how it works. And we really have to think about our actions individually and collectively. One of the things that we have not thought about adequately is our food supply. So it's not, again, just doctors and patients, it's also what we feed our animals. This is, from about a year ago, the farms as petri dishes of antibiotic resistance. What do we feed our animals? And is there an overdependence of industrialized agriculture on antibiotics? And are we looking always for these loopholes to find a way to fatten up the cow or the chicken or the pig? And really undermining not only their health, but also our health as well. This is a picture that I took myself from Karachi, the largest buffalo colony in the world. In a radius of about 4 square miles, there are 440,000 buffaloes, almost 500,000 buffaloes. And there's an environmental catastrophe going on over there. Routinely in the feed, you would mix antibiotics. There are no checks and balances. And here I'm not picking on one country or the other. I'm talking about really rethinking about global agriculture and farming. Again, because what happens in one country really starts to affect others. United States, compared to other European countries, is actually quite bad in terms of its antibiotic regulations in food and agriculture. Now, I'm not one of those people who would say that you should never give an animal an antibiotic. If there's an infection, I think this would be unethical not to give animal an antibiotic, but to use it prophylactically. Use it not for infection control, but as a loophole to increase the mass, the weight of the animal. I do have problems with that. And we are seeing poor regulation of the animal sector, again playing a role on the world stage in creating pandemics. I want to spend a few minutes about another area of my own research. As colleagues mentioned in the introduction, I spend quite a bit of time on global health. I took this picture from a refugee camp. It's a health center very close to the Uganda-South Sudan border. And in the health center there, of course, you'll find plenty of people who need antibiotics. There's infection. And there is no panel or a test or a lab where you can sort of do a blood sample and find whether you're resistant to Cipro or amoxicillin or this drug or that. You get the antibiotic, not the one that you need, but the one that they have. That may work for you or it may not. There is a question of equity here. On one end, there is an excess of antibiotics. On the other hand, people cannot even access life-saving drugs. And there's something for us to think about, again, as we think about global inequity. Think about what it means in this country and elsewhere of not having access to frontline medicines, a COVID test. And why is it that some communities do much worse than others when it comes to pandemic? We also have, so the lesson 6 is that being US and Eurocentric is wrong for a whole host of reasons. Focusing only on rich countries, rich neighborhoods, rich cities is ethically wrong, morally wrong, and is really, really bad public health practice. So I want to spend the last 5 minutes or so, I know I have about 8 minutes, on the present and the future, where we are and where we're headed in this regard. When it comes to discovery of new antibiotics, we are not doing very well. The small molecule antibiotic pipeline is actually quite weak. In general, the number of antibiotics entering from phase 1 to the one that might reach a market is about 2%. There are only about 45 of them in various stages right now, which means that the likelihood of them coming to market is actually quite small. So where did it break down? It breaks down because of the economics of the model. And I know we'll talk about that in the panel as well. If you are sort of really investing in new antibiotics, this is not the safest or the surest bet. You could do much better with drugs that are focused on cancer, that are focused on central nervous system, musculoskeletal disorders, cardiovascular systems, immunomodulators. Antibiotics actually are not a good business. There's several reasons for that. One of them is that you take antibiotics for 3, 5, maybe 10 days. On the other hand, you take these drugs for a much longer period of time. There's also a higher chance of becoming resistant. So all that money you spend in creating a new antibiotic, well, it may actually not work, as we have seen over the last 8 or 9 decades. And then there's another problem. Let's say you are very smart, and I know there are many, many smart people in the sort of group today that we are speaking to. Imagine that you're really smart and you come up with a new antibiotic and it works really well. What do you think the government is going to say? Well, the government is going to say that, well, this is really good, but we can only use it for exceptional circumstances. We can't use it every day because people will become resistant, or the pathogens will become resistant to it. And that is not a very attractive proposition. If you can't use it because it's really good, well, that's not very attractive. And a variety of other reasons, including sort of over-the-counter prescription in many countries of the world, including the one where I grew up, the issue of poor quality medicines and fake drugs. All of these things make antibiotics not the most interesting business to get into. So on the other hand, we are dealing with this challenge, global challenge of antimicrobial resistance. On the other hand, the market isn't quite working out. So we have to think about, what is the right market model? How do we strengthen the market? And one of those approaches is based again at Boston University, headed by a colleague and a friend of mine, Professor Kevin Outerson. It's called CARB-X. And it starts to really use a variety of funding mechanisms to support small companies take things to market. So it is funded by Wellcome Trust and Gates Foundation and NIH and a number of other institutions. The idea is that people, and it would sort of incentivize testing, it would incentivize developing new antibiotics, allowing companies to take it to market. But just as a sign of the fact that how broken it is, let me show you a story that came out this week. Oops. Yeah, thank you. So there was a story that CARB-X funds GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, one of the global pharmaceutical companies, giants in pharmaceutical companies, develop a new drug for urinary tract infection, one of the most common antimicrobial resistance problems. This is really exciting on some ways. CARB-X really thinking of new drugs. But if CARB-X has to support GSK, this consortium that doesn't have a lot of money, does have some, but doesn't have a lot of money, was focused largely on small companies. And if GSK cannot find it within its own resources to really do that, tells you that we really have to rethink, that we have to bring multiple groups together and rethink where the problem is. And that's something for us to think about. The pipeline does not inspire confidence. A year ago, the pipeline for COVID vaccines would have been completely dry. It would have been non-existent. So there's something for us to think about innovation and ingenuity and creativity. and how do we really think about future preparation. My last slide is my last lesson is actually perhaps the most important one. People ask me when I was writing this book, am I hopeful? And what has history taught us? My answer to that is there is hope, indeed. But it comes from one word, and that is humility. A recognition that we are all in this together. A recognition that it's scientists and engineers who have to play a role, but it's also people in finance, people in law, people in public advocacy, people in areas of government, people in the defense sector, people in public health. They all have to come together. Nobody, scientists or engineers, people in the lab or people in high offices, nobody has the ability to do it alone. It's a lesson in collaboration. It's a lesson in recognition that people have to come together across borders, across boundaries, traditional and non-traditional. We can't have higher walls on our borders. We can't have a me first or me only or sort of a nationalistic view. If we really are going to make a change, it has to come from humility. And perhaps the greatest lesson of history of studying antibiotic resistance is that it allows us an opportunity to fix the things that we did wrong. It tells us how we got here. It also holds a key on how we can fix it. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammad. That was wonderful. Also want to note and apologies to the audience. There's a little bit of a lag in the audio and the video, and I don't think we can fix that at the moment. So you'll just have to hang with us. Muhammad, you gave us a huge amount to think about in this in your talk, and as I was listening, I was pondering how to digest it all. One perspective really comes from your book, which you really tell the tales of thousands of years of the fight against bacterial infection. And what struck me about that more than anything, and more than the science and all of that, is really aligned with what you said about humility. It's the humble determination by people again and again to overcome apathy and ignorance and political ego, frankly, to save humanity almost from itself. And that's how you ended. But it struck me that we face two challenges with that. One is that as we solve the problem of the threat of antibiotics, it actually diminishes the will to have that humility. It takes away, it's the threat itself of a common enemy that often brings us together and puts down our usual guard. And so we solve it, we are less compelled to work together, and we get lax. And we've seen that over the decades with antibiotics, but we're seeing that in the course of weeks with COVID. As soon as we come out of a terrible wave of disease, people get lax again. So with that in mind, I'm curious if there's anything you've distilled from all of those stories over thousands of years that suggests to you a way out of that conundrum. How can we get people to come together?
I think that's a really good question. I don't know, Tim, if I have any real answer to it, except for the fact that we really have to work with ordinary people. These are the real heroes and heroines on a day-to-day basis, right? I mean, somebody working in a small little hospital in Ghana without any sort of expectation of glory, perhaps not getting paid on time, but doing it because they're genuinely interested in public health. So I tell my students, if they ever get a chance, travel, go and see the world, talk to people in far corners of the world. That tells you sort of this remarkable grace and dignity of these scientists, these public health professionals, these farmers, these doctors, these nurses. And I think we get too comfortable in our own little bubble and just don't recognize that all around us are these just absolutely remarkable people. The more we do that, the better we'll be. This is one of the things that I've learned. I'll be very frank here. The last 4 years, and perhaps it's a political statement, but I'll say it anyway. The last 4 years have not been easy for somebody of my faith in this country. And most people who had ever felt a strong animosity towards Muslims were people who had never met a Muslim. And I think we can say this about many different groups. And our level of comfort comes oftentimes with this level of complacency, this level of being in a bubble. And the more we can do to sort of burst that bubble scientifically, working across disciplines, individually, from a humanitarian side, I think the more prepared we'll be to work together and not wait until a great challenge comes our way to bring us together, because that challenge sooner or later is going to go away. And we'll go back to our ordinary normal state, whatever that may be. But we have to sort of challenge that on an individual level.
Okay. Well, thank you. I was getting I'm dealing with two things here. One is the thoughts about what you said of the bubble and the question of whether we should take a break to address the live stream feed issue. And I'm so apologies for that distraction, but I think we're going to continue for now with the discussion, and instead of taking a break. But before my next question, I wanted to just remind folks to go ahead and send your questions in via Twitter. You can reach us at Riffyn Events, the hashtag Riffyn Events. So just shoot out a Twitter post with that hashtag, and we'll pick it up and carry that forward to our speakers. So we actually have one question already, Muhammad, that I wanted to pose to you. It is about what you mentioned about antibiotics in farming, in particular, the outlook for addressing that issue. How do we solve it? And do you think the solution lies in restricting supply or in trying to address demand?
So I think that's a really good question. I think a lot of it is starting with awareness. We now have ample data to say that in many cases, actually, antibiotic addition does not help the animal or the farmer. A lot of it actually has to do with demand, but also awareness. So, for example, in some of our work, we have worked with the farmers in Bangladesh or in Thailand, and they are able to move away from antibiotic sort of heavy feed to almost zero antibiotics if there was demand, but also historical data has started to show that the advantage is actually quite marginal. So if we are able to create economic models that are addressing some of those subsidies, but also increasing awareness, I think we'll start to see some changes. But we cannot do this top down. You talk to a farmer in Bangladesh and tell him that, well, sitting here in the US, I think you should stop using antibiotics because it's really going to create this pandemic in the future. That is not going to go very far. Again, make allies, work on the ground, and you'll start to see some changes. So there has to be a science issue, there has to be an economic issue, but awareness and working in the community. I do not think one size fits all is going to work with either fixing only the supply side or the demand side. I think you'll have to work on both of those.
Terrific, thanks. It reminds me, as I hear you comment on that, the concept of our bubbles and how we get isolated. We're all obviously very hyper aware of that today because of the bubbles and the tribalism we see every day in our society. But the truth is, there's a bit of that in science and academia and drug discovery too. We get caught up in those bubbles, and I know that that's part of the motivation of why we have this event, to reach out to all of you who don't normally hear that message, and also to create the opportunities for some budding scientists and communities that don't normally have access to it to reach out and start to participate. And what I really appreciate about your comment is it's not just a science problem. it's an everything problem if we want to tackle this. And so from there, I wanted to turn to another aspect of what you spoke about, which is this idea that the market itself is maybe not addressing our needs. So you brought up a couple of points. You mentioned how drugs get put on the shelf, and you talked about after they're developed, and you talked about Carbex as a potential solution to this, that there's this public-private partnership to push the development of drugs. But it actually leaves me a little bit confused, because if that's successful, if Carbex does develop a new drug, aren't we just going to put it on the shelf and see another situation like happened recently, where a new drug was developed by a company called Achaogen after 2 decades? It went on the market, it got approved, and then after a year, they sold $1 million of a drug that took billions to develop, and they went bankrupt. And now that drug, I'm not sure what happened to it, but isn't Carbex going to end up with the same fate?
That's a great question. I think you have to. So Carbex is not solving the market problem completely. It's trying to get through sort of this valley of death part where you have early promise and you need enough to get to market. But then at the same time, you'll also need market incentives, perhaps paying up early, perhaps having incentives for companies to really recoup the prices early on, or having fixed demand. So whether it is sort of a model where countries and decide to have sort of what they call a Netflix model, right? So you have basically a subscription fee, and you pay for all the antibiotics, whether you use them or not, and you sort of divide it early on. Or you decide to sort of put up money upfront, kind of like a prize or early market incentive or market entry rewards, as they're called. You will have to create those. Carbex is not designed to solve that problem. Carbex is designed to solve a problem that is pre-market collapse, is so that we can have more of these companies and more diagnostics to come to the market. And then at the same time, you'll have to have Carbex version 2 to address the market thing. And Carbex, frankly, Tim, doesn't even have enough money to recoup all of the costs. I mean, it's about $500 million. Sounds a lot of money, sounds like a lot of money, but divided over many, many companies, it's not a lot of money. So you're trying to solve a first part of the problem of strengthening the pipeline, and then you have to solve the second part of the problem as well. But you're right, you'll have to, in some ways, solve them simultaneously.
Thank you. So let me put that question to you, Daria. Merck is one of the few pharmaceutical companies that still produces a lot of antibiotics, and I'm curious your take on that. Why are you still in it? Is it pure philanthropy? And what solutions do you see to address the market aspects of this problem?
Yeah, no, Merck is in it because, we have a long history of working in infectious diseases, not just antibiotics, antifungals, antivirals, vaccines. And we still see there is a huge amount of unmet need in all of those areas. And so we're very committed to continuing to solve, problems where there is a significant, unmet need, and use our experience, our expertise, and resources to do so where we think we can have impact. But I agree with Dr. Zaman that the issues are along the entire chain of the pipeline. There is a lack of innovation, and I don't, I think it's very simplistic to think that a lack of innovation exists because of a lack of funding. I think it's far more complicated than that. I mean, a lot of really smart people in pharmaceutical companies throughout the last 2 decades, as well as in academic and academic science, have really tried to find new antibiotics. And what's really quite sobering, honestly, is that if you look at what's in the pipeline, they're largely, almost exclusively, iterations on the same mechanisms that we've known about for 20, 30 plus years. So there really is, there really is a lack of innovation in the antibiotic pipeline, and I think there needs to be continued investment, not just in the pharmaceutical business, but in academic science, to really try to to um, to forge, the understanding that's really needed to innovate in this space. We can't just keep making, new versions of beta lactam inhibitors and staying one step ahead of resistance. Meaning the bacteria have figured out how to do it with first generation inhibitors, and they're only, a small step ahead, behind, trying to develop resistance to the next generation and the next generation, the next generation. They've already solved this problem. So we need to invest in the science, to really help drive innovation, and a lot of that science occurs, in the academic setting. I also agree that that there needs to be pull incentives to continue efforts in the pharmaceutical industry, because what we bring to the table is 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 uh, is also the ability to take that innovation, and use it in a way that creates the molecules that have all of the right properties to become drugs. Right. So it's an understanding of the science and marrying that with all of the expertise. And it takes an army. It truly takes an army of people, to really to discover the molecules, and to develop them. So there needs to be some incentive at the end of that, for that investment to happen, even if the innovation is there and ripe and ready to act upon. So I think there needs to be investment in the science, and there needs to be incentives so that we can take those innovations and turn them into things that have the potential to truly have impact. And I think the COVID epidemic, I think, is a really interesting example, of how we've failed to learn that lesson, because there was, before COVID 2, there was SARS, there was MERS, and there was a lot of investment in a very short period of time in coronavirus biology, and in trying to make drugs and trying to make vaccines against coronaviruses. And when those threats disappeared, that investment went away. Right? Now, luckily, we learned from those experiences, and we're able to relatively quickly turn things around. But if those investments had continued, we would have been able to do that far more quickly. But there was no reason to do that, because there was no incentive to do so. So I think the lessons that we're learning now can be applied to antibacterial resistance, can be applied to the next coronavirus pandemic, can be applied to the next flu pandemic. And I think we need to learn from those lessons and continue to invest. Otherwise, history will just continue to repeat itself.
I
So,
want to add
so
something
go ahead.
that Daria mentioned. She's absolutely right. So for gram negative, we haven't had a new product since 1960s, right? So we're dealing with sort of situations where these are the sort of rehashed versions of what has already been done. So that's absolutely right. I'll tell you a little anecdote. When I was working on my book, I spoke to colleagues in community hospitals in the US. At a hospital in Detroit, there were not enough applicants to fill infectious disease doctor residencies because people were just not going into those. So the point that the innovation wasn't happening is absolutely right on the mark. New graduate students were not interested in doing infectious diseases. The best resident was not applying for a position in an infectious disease lab, which had happened perhaps decades ago. This wasn't the case. So perhaps with coronavirus, things might change, but this innovation sort of, I would say, issue that Daria mentioned is actually very, very, very real. Not only are there funding issues that we mentioned, there are also sort of human capital issues and innovation issues all across the board in fundamental and in applied sciences, in medicine and engineering and basic sciences.
So we have an incentive problem in 3 areas: incenting people to get involved in antimicrobial research, because for some years it hasn't been the sexy part of science. It's there's incentives needed to support and advance the research once it gets going, and there's incentives needed in the marketplace to buy the drugs and to create a market, a pull to keep those companies producing them. And there was an interesting question from the audience that came in while you were talking, which speaks to those incentives, but maybe also speaks to this idea of popping the bubbles. And they noted that Merck and J&J just partnered to produce the COVID vaccine, and wondered if that signals anything. If we can read into that as maybe a path to the future of collaboration addressing addressing this problem of antimicrobial disease. I mean,
It's a,
resist.
and it's not, this is not the first time this happened. I remember watching, I was not yet involved in infectious disease research, but I remember watching what happened in the early days of the HIV epidemic, where there was incredible collaboration across the board, across academic science, pharmaceutical science, between pharmaceutical companies, between regulatory authorities. It's a beautiful story of collaboration, because if you think about it, from the time HIV was discovered as the causative agent of AIDS, to the time we had triple combination therapy, was little more than 10 years. And that required inventing 3 completely different classes of agents and putting them together and doing the clinical studies. It takes over a decade, 15 plus years, to develop any one new molecular entity in under ordinary circumstances. So it can happen. It did happen. Why it doesn't happen, more routinely? It's a really good question, but it's great to see that we can, under extraordinary circumstances, come together as an industry and do things like this.
As a matter of fact, the greatest inventions that turned the tide to a great extent in the Second World War, penicillin. Again, a very similar story. Also, Merck involved there in how it went from the UK to the US, from the US in sort of these large manufacturing facilities in Illinois to the Office of Research with Vannevar Bush and a number of companies coming together, Pfizer and Merck among them, and working together to produce, again, extraordinary circumstances. Right, there's a war going on. There's a very serious issue, and it shouldn't take a war or a global pandemic for people to come together. And I think Daria is absolutely right.
One of the things that struck me about your book, Muhammad, a story in there, and that's relevant, I think, to this idea of aggregating people and ideas and breaking barriers, is the role of data. We live in a different world from a data perspective now. And you mentioned there was a passage in your book about Tori Midtvedt in Norway, who helped solve the problem of antimicrobial resistance, drug resistance in Norway, and overuse of antibiotics in salmon farming. And he did that in part by using a database he'd collected over many, many years of 55,000 clinical samples to establish the patterns of disease across the country. That put in striking relief to me the role of data and data transparency in solving our problems. And I wonder, while we talk a lot about the drugs and the reactive, in a sense, approach to the disease, is there a more proactive or preventative approach that could harness the new tools of data? And I wanted to put that question first to Daria. Do you see patterns or possibilities there for using data to address this without developing new drugs?
I think data is incredibly powerful. I mean, data is used all the time in the hospital setting to really understand, the ecology and how to properly use antibiotics, and down to the hospital level. It's pretty amazing. And that really has had a major impact on antimicrobial stewardship. And antimicrobial stewardship over the past decade has been shown to work. I mean, we track drug resistance very, very carefully, in a protocol that we call SMART, globally, and it's striking, that we can actually show that antimicrobial stewardship has decreased the spread of drug resistant bacteria. So data is incredibly powerful.
How much has it reduced the spread? Do you have any perspective for all of us on the progress we're making?
It's I don't have the hard numbers that I can share off the top of my head, but
Sure.
it is really amazing.
Yeah.
We're not
Is
out of the
that
woods for sure, you know, um, but it does have an impact.
that's awesome. Um, Muhammad, do you have any thoughts on that same question?
No, I think Daria said it very well. I can only tell you that Torre Midbudet is a delightful grandfather of antimicrobial research in Norway. Somebody whose father saw sort of the night of the broken glass, the famous incident in Nazi Germany against during the Holocaust, and was motivated to really stand up against the Nazis. And so he's a remarkable family story of service and kindness, but somebody who was remarkably dogged in his approach. And this idea of data is a sign of innovation. He was doing it when people thought this was absolutely crazy, collecting those punch cards and putting them in these boxes and then temporarily losing them. But really thinking about why it needs to happen. The story about salmon fishing is also incredible, of the use of vaccination. So most Norwegian salmon that you'll probably find now in the nearest grocery store, smoked salmon or otherwise, is actually vaccinated. There was a point in Norway when antibiotics were mixed in cement mixers and dumped in the fishing farms, to the point that the water was becoming black. Again, innovation and looking at the data and seeing what you can do to change it. So data is two-dimensional here. One is discovery of new antibiotics, new therapeutic regimens, but also seeing where are the opportunities to cut the use and use alternative methods. So his story is just absolutely remarkable, also because he's such an incredibly kind man, and was just so generous with his time.
So I'm
Speaking of,
glad you mentioned vaccines, because it is another hat that I wear, and so I think it's incredibly underappreciated, how important a tool vaccines are to prevent the use of antibiotics. Preventing a disease is always, preferable to being to trying to treat it to treat it later on. And the one thing that personally concerns me, and we'll see how this continues to evolve after the pandemic, is over, is the extraordinary reluctance and the growing reluctance people have towards vaccination, when it is one of the most powerful tools we have in our arsenal, of impacting global human health.
yet another
Absolutely.
problem of information and social structures more than a scientific one.
Absolutely. And again, this is again an area where we have to think about working across disciplinary boundaries and work with communities and build confidence and build trust. Having a vaccine is one thing; getting it in somebody's arm is quite another. And we really have to think about, across the multiple sort of avenues in which understand and address these issues of vaccine hesitancy. So yet another example of that. Absolutely.
Um, I wanted to turn as we wrap up in the next 5 minutes, I wanted to turn the page a little bit to a slightly different topic, one a little bit more personal to you, Muhammad, and then ending on a note that's perhaps more personal to all of us. But my first question really relates to your work as a columnist. You have been writing for the Express Tribune and a Pakistani newspaper since 2012, as I could fathom from the internet, and that's a weekly column, more than 400 posts since 2012. It's kind of unfathomable to me how you could manage to pull that off. And the question really, well, it's not just the prolific nature of your work, but the spectrum from science to politics, democracy, human rights, disease, social inequality, and not just in Pakistan, but also the parallels between the U.S. and Pakistan. And I couldn't do that myself, but I wonder where your energy comes from. Where does that seemingly endless stream of ideas come from? And do you spend every Sunday night hiding from your family?
All of that is true. I do hide, but Tim, I think it's a part of my identity. I am very much a Pakistani. I grew up there. I have family there. I care about that society. I'm also an American. I care about this society. And it's my way of sharing what I think is important and often what I think is wrong. And people can disagree. People would disagree, and I think they should. But the energy actually comes from having a sense of purpose there, in being troubled by things that so there are grand problems that we all need to solve, but they're tiny little problems that are well within our reach to fix. And it bothers me that we don't, right? So before we started, we were talking about sort of the fact that there are these people who are stateless in Pakistan who have no identity. They can be the smartest people in the world, but they wouldn't get a chance to sort of sit in the national exams and go to medical school or be able to study what they wanted to study. They don't exist, but they do. And we need to tell their stories. We need to talk about them. And that really bothers me. So I think the energy comes from the world around me, and recognizing that we all have a role to play. And I feel that we have to speak up for what is right. Life is short, and I just want to look back at my life and say, well, I stood up for the issues that I cared about.
Absolutely. In fact, I want to pick up on that last point. You talked about statelessness of some people, and I wanted to actually expand on that to help the audience understand what you're talking about. I'm going to read in my final questions here. I'm going to preface it with an excerpt from your book. So I'll read. In the third week of January 2021, a team of young girls, sorry, apologies, this is not from your book. This is from your column posted on February 8th. In the third week of January 2021, a team of young girls from Karachi, born and raised in an urban slum, brought home a rare accolade. The team of five won a first prize in an international gymnastics competition held in Russia, defeating teams from all around the world. However, there was a problem. The country that the girls thought they were representing did not recognize them as its own daughters. There was not going to be any recognition by any mayor, minister, or bureaucrat. In their minds and in their hearts, they represented Pakistan. The state, however, did not think so. They may have been born and raised in Karachi. They may have seen no other country, but for the state, they do not exist. They never have. The only reason these girls could participate in the competition was because it was online. One needs identification documents to book flights and apply for visas. That privilege is not available to those who do not exist. They may be good in what they do, but are not lucky enough to have any identification. They're not allowed to dream. I read that and I was honestly shocked. I was reeling in shock and reading that type of situation, and I couldn't fathom such inequity, except that I can, because every day we see the very same here in the United States, both in the force of law and in the force of cultural bias. And it's troubling, I think, for so many of us. So I ask first to you, Muhammad, how do you understand this sad reality? Is it Is it an unavoidable ugliness of the human heart?
That's a very good question. I'll tell you a little story, Tim. I work with one of the larger high schools in New York City, the Bronx High School, very diverse. Have students from all over the region, and so I was giving a talk. We were talking about vaccines and antibiotics, and one student who was absolutely brilliant, I could tell from previous questions, said that, "How do you know that the COVID vaccine is not another Tuskegee? It's not another way of subjugating the African Americans or sort of torturing them?" And of course, I didn't have an answer. She's not an anti-vaxxer. She is not somebody who dismisses science. She is burdened by the enormous weight of injustice. And I don't know if it comes from a hard or a dark place in our hearts, but I do know that there are enough people out there who are really longing for a situation where they can trust the system again. And I think it is important for every single one of us, and particularly scientists and engineers and researchers and doctors, to do their bit in building that trust. We owe it to them, and we owe it to ourselves. And if there's a dark place in a human heart, maybe that action might help scrub that a little bit, one little dot at a time.
Thank you. And Daria, would you like share any thoughts on that same question? Do you see a path for us away from the ugliness, and in particular, given this story, a way to help level the playing field for women in science and senior leadership positions?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question, obviously. But knowledge is power, and a willingness to share our knowledge, and not be elitist. In is, I think, really important to level the playing field and create a culture that is welcoming and encourages people to participate. I think is really key.
Well, thank you both. I really appreciate your time tonight, the incredible insights and thoughts. We heard a lot of ideas and some themes that came out, which I summarize for those of you who might want to participate in helping solve this ongoing challenge of antimicrobial drug resistance. Incentives, social bubbles, and data transparency really emerged as key themes. And there's opportunities, no matter what your walk of life or your profession, to get involved. And I hope maybe this talk will inspire some of you to do that. You know where to find us if you want help in connecting your interest in participating with opportunities to make an impact. So I want to wrap up. It's been a great evening. I want to thank Muhammad and Daria particularly for the conversation tonight. I want to thank Merck for co-hosting this event with us. And I want to thank the audience for joining us and managing through the audio delay. And I encourage you all to share what inspired you from this talk tonight on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can use the Riffyn event hashtag to do so. We'll carry the conversation forward interactively there. And happy to continue to respond to your questions over Twitter, even after this event. We will make this recording available on demand. It'll be posted on Riffyn's website for you to watch at any time. And we will have this event twice a year. We hope the next time it happens, it will actually be in person, but we will still live stream it, broadcast it for all of those of you who might want to participate remotely. So please stay tuned to that. We'll keep you updated on the next distinguished lecture. And I want you all to have a great night. Thanks for joining us.